Everyone. What we're going to do today is we're going to go through all of Masechet Sukkah using the simanim for Zichru. Zichru is a program in which you memorize different points from every daf in Shas. So for Masechet Sukkah, we said there were 3 points every single daf. We're going to run through them now, starting with daf bet all the way through daf nun vav. I think if I do it about 10 dafim per, let's say, every 5 minutes. Let's see if this takes 15 minutes. Not sure what your estimate will be. 55 dafim. I'm going to record on my phone as well. Starting right now with daf bet is a bayit. First point is that a sukkah that is over 20 amos is pasul, the Mishnah tells us. Next point on the daf, so I'm going to be discussing the 3 reasons why that this sukkah is pasul. We discussed 3 different reasons. Ma'ayin Doratechem is one of them. And then we move on to the third point on the daf, which discusses within one of the reasons what happens when you have a sukkah where the schach does not reach the final schach, or the final has a gap between the walls and the actual schach. That's the end of daf bet. Moving to daf gimel, which is a camel. Sounds like a camel. The first point is going to be the machloket behil beit shammai, the minimum size of a sukkah. Okay, we'll move on to the next point on the daf, which is going to be discussing, once we're discussing, maybe it was part of that discussion that a sukkah has to be 4 by 4 amos, and we define it as something that's a significant structure, 4 by 4 amos. So we move on to discuss what happens now when you have something other considerations where something requires 4 by 4 amos. We explained that for considering to build a balcony, or to build a mezuzah, or to have a bayit that you can leave to go out to war with, if you have built a new house, the definition for a bayit for all these cases is going to be 4 by 4 amos. But then we mentioned one of those cases, the third point on the daf, is that we have a case where something does not require 4 by 4 amos, but for other things it would require 4 by 4 amos, and that is regard to an Erev Chatzirut. You do require 4 by 4 amos in order to have a structure that one can fulfill an Erev Chatzirut within. For an Erev Shutuf Mavut, for an Erev Shutuf, you do not need to have 4 by 4 amos. That's the end of Daf Gimel. Daf Dal is a delit. First point is going to be when you have the sukkah that you use walls that with branches, Hotzei v'Dafna. The second point is going to be when you ban la itztava, when you build a platform in the middle that you will be able to extend upwards. And the third point is going to be good azig masechta, famous principle throughout the Masechet, that you extend upwards as well, and a different way of the itztava platform from within the sukkah. So tefachim extended upwards. Good asik. We'll learn a lot about it. Move on to daf hey. Daf hey is hey. So the first point is going to be discussing the minimum height size. We discussed that we're going to be understanding the aron in the Beit HaMikdash, one of the kelim in the mikdash was 10 tefachim tall, and we learn out the top layer, the kapor, to it's 1 tefach. How do we know this? The second point of daf discusses that it was 1 tefach thick based off of the height of the shulchan. The shulchan also had a crown on top, one sort of thing that was 1 tefach. We see other kelim that have this 1 tefach on top crown, so therefore the aron is 10 tefachim tall, which is the second point. The third point is discussing the breadth space, the wingspan you could have for the minimum size requirement between a sukkah, and we said that's 10 tefachim. We learned out from the kruvim, as the height of the kruvim was 10 tefachim tall. That one need a little bit more brushing up on. That's the end of daf hey. Move on to daf vav. Daf vav is a sword. The first point we're going to be discussing is shir and chatzitzin are halacha Moshe Sinai. That we find that the first point that we define the shiurim that we learn out from the Torah, we learn from psukim. They're halacha Moshe Sinai for kazayis, for a different sizes for different of the shivaminim, are all learned out in the Torah halacha Moshe Sinai. Then we move on to discuss the second point is going to be chatzitzas halacha Moshe Sinai. Might be rove, whether you're makbid about a chatzitza, whether it may be the halacha we learn out halacha Moshe Sinai. Which we move on to the third point of daf vav. We're going to be discussing a similar principle of walls of sukkah with regard to the minimum size or minimum requirement of the amount of walls, which we define as going to be 2 and a tefach. Okay, which is one opinion. We just said other opinion is 3 and a tefach. The daf zayin, or is a clay zayin, discusses with regard to this minimum wall requirement to define a structure for sukkah. Does that apply for same dinim for Shabbos? For Shabbos, certain things will apply if you have Rishut Yach or Rishut Rabim, if it's a structure or not. So that's daf zayin. The first point is whether or not we compare this to one of the walls and a tefach for Shabbos reasoning. So I move on to the second point on daf, which is discussing that a sukkah requires to have more sunlight than shade. And third point on daf, we're discussing there's different tanaim who hold that a sukkah has to be a dirat keva, and Rabbi Yehuda is one of them because he holds that a sukkah has to have, I think, 4 by 4 amos. Anyway, different tanaim we discussed that a sukkah has to have a dirat keva status, not dirat arai, temporary, as opposed to dirat keva, which means permanent. Move on to daf chet, which is chala. The first point is going to be discussing that what happens when you have a sukkah sukkah kivsham, which is circular. If you have 24 people, it discusses the circumference, gets into a lot of math. That's the first point. Daf chet. Second point is going to be sukkah to yotzrim. When you have a sukkah within a sukkah, right? That's the way they'd have it. So we said the outer one is going to be chayiv and mezuzah, and it's the outer one's going to be chayiv. It's going to be a valid sukkah. The inner one's going to be chayiv mezuzah, not vice versa. Interesting chiluk there. And the third point is going to be discussing sukkah ganvach v'rakvash. We have an acronym for different types. A woman or an animal builds a sukkah. Is it kosher or goy? Anyway, move on to the next daf. We're going to be discussing daf teapot. First point we're going to be discussing when Midhil and Midsham have a machlokas about getting hanav from the walls. At what point are you allowed to or not allowed to use a sukkah or get hanav from the walls? Machlokas based off the pasuk and the Torah. Then move on to the second point, which is discussing that when you have a sukkah that's hachat ilan, and the third point is going to be sukkah gali sukkah. Okay, beautiful. Common cases. Stop yud. Moving on to the second set. Moving on to the second, you could call it set of 10. Okay, daf yud. Moving on, dominion of yidin. First point is going to be discussing that which we left off on daf tet, that we say if you have a sukkah, that a sukkah is built on top of it, sukkah, agabe sukkah, how do we define what minimum requirement would this top sukkah have to be, how large would it have to be in order to be considered a second sukkah and not just an extension of the first one? And we say, according to one opinion, if it's larger than one tefach gap from this one to the next one, that's going to be considered a second sukkah and not one large one. Okay, daf, the yod second point is going to be discussing what happens if you use decorations for a sukkah, like over here. If they are blocking up shade, whatever it may be, if they're used to gather leaves, whatever it is for different purpose, then it could be a separation between you and the schach. However, if it's just used for decoration purposes, like this one, then it is fine. No yeh hasukah is how the Gemara describes it. Okay, that's the second point. The third point is going to be discussing if one can sleep under a kilois or in canopy, they would have, if you're allowed to sleep under, you could say kriyat shema when you're arum. All different discussions. Ayin sham, daf yud aleph. Moving on is going to be discussing the 11 stars in Yosef's dream, which reminds us of the when you cut off something and it's completed, and when that one process of cutting it, we apply this first to tzitzis. If you just cut off the tzitzis and then it's completely prepared strings, is that kosher? Then we apply this to the berries on a hadas. If you cut off the berries off of a hadas, do we apply this by berries for on a hadas to make it kosher? And then we discuss the third point, and that's going to be discussing that schach has to be something that's guduli karka from the ground, as well as davar she'ena makabel tuma. Beautiful. Daf yud bet. Move on to discuss the 12 sons. So the first point we're going to be discussing is going to be what happens if one is chotet begadish, if one makes a hollow area inside of a haystack, whatever it may be, in order to make it into valid sukkah. We say it's fine. And the second point there, chavile kash, using straw. The second point on daf yud bet is going to be discussing if one uses a male arrow, it's kosher because it has a bit kibul. It does not have a bit kibul, therefore male arrows are the ones that point out the projections outwards, and female arrows are the ones that receive, so they are the shaft, so to speak. And it does not, when it has a bit kibul, it is makabel tuma, and therefore you cannot use female arrows to have it on top of your schach, meaning as your schach, but you can use male arrows. Interesting idea. And the third point that's going to be discussing, if you use different smelly bushes like fern or different plants that smell bad, it is not something that's convenient, and therefore it is an invalid schach. Okay, move on to daf yud gimel, which is discussing bar mitzvah boy. First point that's going to be discussing Rabbi Yehuda's shita that davar cold or eged b'dei shemayim, maybe something that's naturally formed. That's called a twist or a bundle, whatever it may be. Lav shmei eged, and it does not count as real eged. It does not, because it's just eged b'dei shemayim, was naturally created this way. We do not give it the psul of eged when it comes to schach or different things for the sukkah walls. So we discussed this as well when it comes to the conical huts. The second point on the daf, that the bird catchers would use to chop birds. We say that that's kosher because it's not fully pleated, does not have the right consistency, right? I guess quality to be considered eged that would be invalidated. And the third point on daf is going to be discussing the third point on daf yud gimel is going to be discussing the using maror as schach. Interesting. Okay, daf yud dalet going to be discussing yad is going to be discussing that Shem treats the tefillah tzaddikim like an esser, like a pitchfork, an etter, if you will, which it means that Shem will flip over minat din, minat harachim, to accept these, like you flip over something in the granary and the grain in the threshing floor with a pitchfork. Move on to daf yud dalet. Point number 2 is going to be if you build a sukkah with nisarim, if you build it with wooden planks, not this sukkah, but other sukkahs, wooden planks, it's kosher. And we say it's kosher. What happens if you hofchan sidain, if you flip it on its side in order to get rid of the gaps, whatever it may be? That's discussion. The Gemara there, daf tet vav is 15, tet vav is tu b'shvat fruit bowl, tu b'shvat. We are going to be discussing, and then the first part on daf will be discussing what happens if one has we're discussing what one will be required to do if one has to pick up actually the schach and then place it, or if one has to pick it up and remove it in order to make it kosher. That's the mission there. The second point on that we're going to be discussing if one puts spits, metal spits, or like a bed frame on top of a sukkah, is a kosher schach, is a makabel tuma, etc. And third point related is one use worn out clothing, is makabel tuma, can one use it as valid schach, as we mentioned in daf Yud Aleph, there are two requirements. Schach has to be something that's going to be Mikuduli Karka as well as something that's Inam Makabal Tuma. Okay, moving on to Daf Tet Zayin Toes. The first point is going to be discussing if one hollows out inside a haystack, whatever it may be, a furrow of 1 tefach high by 7 tefachim wide, is that going to be kosher sukkah? We say yes, it seems that way it is. Then the next point is going to be discussing whether or not we apply if you have a mat as your wall of your sukkah, can you hang it up, so to speak? It's talui ba'avir, and then once it's hanging up, could you apply lavud going downwards? Could you apply a good aches mesechta, so to speak? Could you extend it downwards if there's a gap? If this is the wall and there's a gap on the bottom, could you extend it going downward? We say yes, we applied that, and we say the second point is if you use completely talui, you can even apply lavud twice. You can apply it going up from here to the ground to the actual wall, and from the actual top of the wall to the schach, you apply lavud twice, and it still works. Beautiful. Daf Tet Zayin was that. Daf Yud Zayin going to be used car. Daf Yud Zayin, first point, Daf is going to be discussing the concept that avir is posel bishlosha. If you have a gap of air, it could be posel if you have a 3 tefach gap, as well as when it comes to non-kosher schach, it is posel when you have a gap of 4 tefachim. Beautiful. Move on to discussing this. Rabba is challenged by his Talmidim, the second point on the daf, about a question about how it could be more makil when it comes to having avir, when it comes to, as opposed to having sach pasol. Interesting discussion, a little complicated. And Rabba's response, though, is that his idea that avir is pasol is halacha Moshe Sinai, not misvara, and therefore it can have a case where it could be more makil, so to speak. And because it's halacha Moshe Sinai, we could just apply it, and it totally makes sense and it works. Beautiful. That's Daf Yud Zayin. Move on to Daf Yud Chet. Daf Yud Chet is going to be discussing the chuppah. So the first point is going to be discussing what happens when you have a sukkah gdola or sukkah ketana. So a sukkah gdola, if you have a 7 by 7 tefachim of kosher schach, is kosher sukkah, and then you have a gap. So in a sukkah gdola, you can handle having a gap of a certain amount because you still have a kosher sukkah with the leftover schach, but it's supposed to sukkah ketana, but it doesn't have the minimum size requirement of 7 tefachim, and you have a gap, then it will not be kosher. Beautiful. That's moving on to the next point. Is going to be discussing, and within Daf Yud Chet is whether or not you apply lava min emsa min atzad. If you have a gap in the middle, so I'll suck like that today. And the second point Daf going to be discussing that pitik or yod b'sotim, if you have a portico or something that you just have columns, almost like a I guess what we have in this porch over here, when you have something that's like a gondola, could you extend pitik or yod b'sotim, which say the walls extend downwards from the schach? I'm going to say yes, we can do that. Okay, perfect. Daf Yud Tet is a yeah. First point I'm discussing psal yotzim sukkah, when you have schach that sticks out over the side of the sukkah, it's fine. And you also say if you have a sukkah that's kamin srif, nidon kasukah, if it's like a hut, it still counts as a sukkah. And the third point I'm going to be discussing machzol, using mats, whether it be for lying down, could you still use them as your mats for your sukkah here? Common minor discussion, ayin sham, and the achronim. Then move on to daf chaf, which is leather bag cafe. First point I'm discussing on a similar point, the chutzlot, similar type of mats, different discussion. And the second point I'm going to be discussing Harin Kaparat Rabbi Chia and his sons. Gemara discusses a story about when Torah was forgotten in Babel, ayin sham. And the third point daf is going to be discussing the start of the second parak. We mean the second parak is going to be discussing Hayash and Tachanamita, one who sleeps under a bed inside a sukkah. Is it, so to speak, fulfilling his chiyuv of sukkah? Is he allowed to sleep there? Bottom line, seems like to be an interesting discussion. Look at the Gemara there. Moving on to Daf Chaf Aleph is a ka in the Bostonian accent. We say the first point is going to be discussing what happens. Rabbi Huda Shita, similar to Daf Yud Gimel, but Rabbi Huda says that one is Ol b'di Shemayim Lav Shmei Ohel. If you have a natural covering that happens, through natural causes, it is not considered to be an ohel to invalidate things. And the second point that is discussing an interesting discussion how they would raise kids in order to be completely batara, and that would send them out on top of oxes. That way they wouldn't contact Tuma matim from the corpses that were buried on the ground if they were on top of oxes, or whether or not they were on top of the doors and the backs of oxes, in order to prevent them from receiving Tuma, and that way they prepare the Metahara for the Para Aduma. Fascinating discussion there, Ayin Sham. And the third point, Daf, is you can learn from the Slamming from Sichot Talmidei Chachamim. That's the end of Daf Chaf Aleph. Daf Chaf Bet is going to be a cab. First point is going to be discussing a Sukkah Mivdu Lelet. We have the Schach on different levels. Could you actually have it being kosher? Second point explains we apply a Chavarami, which is as if, even though they're in different levels, we make them equal. Beautiful. Moving on to the third point, Daf, it is that even though these different things are existing, we say that if you have a sukkah kim uven kim in bias, if you look over here, the sukkah, we discuss if it's very thick, the schach, they could barely see outside, whether it be if you can't see the sun or if rain can't get through. The Gemara discusses the outcomes of that sukkah, if it's kosher or not. Moving on to Daf Chav Gimel is a kugelach. The first point is going to be discussing very simple cases. Sukkah agabe svina, is it kosher? And the second point is going to be sukkah agabe gamal. If you have a sukkah on top of a camel, the first point is sukkah on top of a boat, kosher. Sukkah on top of a gamal, kosher, whether or not. Okay, third point Daf is going to be discussing if one has a behemoth as a wall in a sukkah. If you just prop up an animal and then you say it's kosher, it's going to run away. Gemara discusses there, is it going to slouch down and you're relying on lovewood? interesting discussion. Anyway, moving on to Daf Chav Dalid, which is going to be discussing the nafkamina between two shitos about whether or not a sukkah has to be able to withstand the mitsuya, the ruach, able to withstand a ruach mitsuya, a common wind, or whether or not it has to be something that is going to be considered to be yatsuya de adam. We say nafkamina is a min nafuach, is some sort of like blown up thing that if theoretically it's created by mankind, but it could blow away. Bottom line is, the Gemara discusses it's nafkamina. That's the first part of Daf Chav Dalid. Second point is going to be if one writes a get on the side or of an animal, is that kosher? Look at Masechet Sukkah, discusses it there as well. Moving on to the third point is going to be if one builds a sukkah between ha'ilanus, Chav Dalid, and the bottom of the daf discusses if one uses those trees as the walls of a sukkah and then just like branch together and, so to speak, thread something through them, is it kosher? Moving on to Daf Chav Hey, different topic is going to be discussing that if you have a shluch mitzvah, somebody who's sent out to fulfill one mitzvah, he's pater min a mitzvah. That means he might be pater min sukkah. All right, a lot of interesting discussions that arrive out of that. And the second point is going to be discussing how do we know this. We discussed we need two sources. One is v'lech techav derech. Other one is going to be discussing from Korban Pesach, v'lech techav derech. When you're on your way, you could do something that's a mitzvah. You're going out to do a mitzvah, then you are, so to speak, within that mitzvah frame. You do not have to go out and do other things. And then the Gemara discusses the second source from the Korban Pesach when you're going out to do it. And Ayin Sham, more discussions. Third point of Daf is going to be discussing an Avil is Chayiv min sukkah, even though it might be Pater min tefillah and other things. Okay, moving on. Daf Chavav, similar point to the first point of Daf Chav, we say that a Chola, and also some of Shluch mitzvah, but a Chola in particular, he is Pater from mitzvah sukkah, and those who assist him are Pater as well. Chola u'misham shav are Pater. Second point is going to be discussing that. That's halfway point, I guess. Chavav 26, 50, not close to halfway, almost halfway. Daf Chavav, second point is going to be discussing if you have a sleeping outside the sukkah, well, how come we say that one can eat, let's say, mazonos, or not mazonos, let's say one can eat fruit outside the sukkah, but one cannot sleep outside the sukkah? What's the difference between shinat arai versus achilat arai? And we say, in the end, we just try and give an example of what shinat arai is. We seem to be referring back to the Gemara and Brachos, where you define shinat arai as shinat as a shinat hasus, which is like pretty much, every 60 breaths they would break up. They would wake up, sorry. So it seems like they would be constantly awake and not stirring, so that's shinat arai, and they would not get a good sleep, we'd call it that. Okay, anyway, we're going to Daf Chav Zayin, which is the kazoo, which is all but Rabbi Eliezer shitas. Rabbi Eliezer has one shita which says that you have to have all 14 meals throughout 7 days of Chag inside a sukkah. Interesting. Meaning that he held that is a chiyuv every single meal to have in the sukkah. Every single meal is a chiyuv for kovei suda with bread, whatever it may be, every day. 14 meals throughout the 7 days. Okay. Then we move on to discuss his second opinion, which is that you have to have entire sukkah, you have to have the entire sukkot inside your own sukkah, one sukkah. And the third point is going to be discussing that you cannot even be within someone else's sukkah, perhaps. So those 2 points are really, I don't remember the order of them, very interchangeable, but bottom line is Rabbi Eliezer is very mahmir, it seems like, and he brings out a lot of interesting ideas about what sukkah is about, staying in your own sukkah, maybe not chalamoa trips. Bottom line, interesting. Rabbi Eliezer has interesting shitas. Moving on to the next daf, is going to be discussing Daf Chav Chet, which is Koach, strong armed men. Great daf in Shas. Listen to Rabbi Leibowitz discussing Rav Shechter's idea of Daf Chav Chet. Maybe Rabbi Leibowitz hinted this is one of his favorite daf in Shas. So moving on, Daf Chav Chet discusses the Talmidim of Hillel Zakin. The greatest of them was the greatest of Hillel Zakin's Talmidim was Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, and the least of them was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Yonatan ben Uziel, when he was learning, the birds would be singed overhead as the Malachim were discussing, trying to listen to his Divrei Torah. Beautiful Gemara, great Agata. Moving on to the next daf, to the next point within Daf Chav is regarding women's chiyuv in the sukkah, and the third point is going to be discussing that what can one learn in the sukkah, what should one learn outside the sukkah when it comes to Torah materials. And with that, we are past the halfway point. Daf Chav Chet out of 56 dafim, 28, just about. Let's do one more, quick daf. At the 19-minute mark, going a little bit slower than I thought, which is good because I'm explaining myself and understanding these thoughts more as Zichru is allowing myself to be able to go over these dafim. We're heading into the Chag of Sukkos. Moving on to Daf Chav Tet. Zikat. First point is going to be is Yardu Gasham. What happens if it starts raining while you're in the middle of a meal and you go inside and it stops raining while you were inside? So do you have to continue the meal back in the sukkah? We said nope, you can finish the meal back inside once you moved inside. Moving on, obviously the first night is more important as far as saying kiddush in the sukkah, having kazayas, ayin sham, look at the halacha. And the second point of that is going to be discussing what happens to the mashal of the evid or the rabbo who spills the pitcher of mayim or whatever it may be, the pitcher, the ketone in the face of the evid. So Hashem says if you're in the sukkah while it's raining, it's like almost like I'm pouring a pitcher of water while it's raining on you and you're staying in the sukkah, so basically don't have to fulfill the mitzvah. Maybe different ways of understanding the story. Then the third point of daf is going to be discussing the third parak of Lulav Hagazl. Great transition to the third parak. Lulav Hagazl, if one steals a Lulav, can it still be used on the first day, like Chacham Lachem? Moving on to Daf Lamed, which discusses a Malamed. The first point is going to be discussing that this mashal of a king and a king and a servant, that he was traveling on a taxed bridge, and he said that I'll pay the tax to show an example that even though the money's coming straight back to me, I will still pay the tax to set an example for everyone else who passes over this bridge to pay the tax as well. And Hashem says the same thing in the pasuk in Malachi, a random, I think in one of the Nevi'im, discussing that Hashem is soneg gezel. Hashem dislikes gezel, dislikes stealing. So why does it matter? Kol Hashem, who we say that when it comes to korban, we should learn properly from Hashem, so to speak, that we should do things entirely in a moral fashion. We should not bring a korban, obviously, if something that's stolen. That would be puzzle. You cannot fix that. Okay, moving on to the next point within Daf Lamed is going to be the third point on the Daf, or the second point of the Daf, which is using a stolen lulav on the second day is still required of lachem. What about the bar lulav? Third point of the Daf is Rav Huna's advice to the Hahu Avankiri, the merchants who would sell lulavim that they would buy from Nochrim. How would they purchase from them? Would they have to have Yerush by them and Shini Reshut? How would they acquire them from the Nochrim? And bottom line, look at the Gemara, their interesting story. Moving on to Daf Lamed Aleph, which is the law. Daf Lamed Aleph discusses Hahisavta, the story of a woman who seemed to get very upset at the Chamim because they seemed to steal her wood for schach. And the Banans said, we just owe you the amount of money to make gezel eats, and we owe you the amount of the wood cost, but we don't have to do anything else. She did not take this too happily. She says she's a patavram, she deserves better. And Chamim seems to say they sort of diffuse the situation. It seems like, look at the story there, Daf Lamed Aleph. Moving on to the second point on Daf is that we say when it comes to a lulav hayavish, Rabbi Yehuda is machshir as opposed to Tanakama, who's posel. When it comes to the lulav, it's dried out a little bit. And the third point on Daf is going to be a lulav hanitztak, which is cracked. Okay, which is a problem. Yeah. Then moving on to Daf Lamed Bet, which leading off of the lulav discussion, then we go by order. So we did Sukkah first, now the third parak discussing lulav, then we're going to Hadassim and Aravim, and eventually Etrog. So now we're in the lulav section of the third parak, which we discussed. The second point on Daf, the first point on Daf Lamed Bet is Nechkat Yomes, when you have the middle leaf is split. At what point is it split? The hymnic, different halachot, different terms that we are supposed to know, so to speak, when buying lulavim. Good to check them out, make sure they're straight. It could be a possible psul. The second point on Daf is going to be when you have a, we mentioned the first point is Nechkat Yomes. The second point on Daf Lamed Bet is the Gemara discusses how do we know that they lulav that the pasuk describes in Kapot Tamarim. The pasuk says a very vague statement about all the arba minim. Kapot Tamarim, how do we know it refers to lulav? Abai says that it can't be a certain tree that has thorns because famous principle that a mitzvah should be something that's na'im, something that's pleasant, and therefore you can't have a thorny lulav. That would be quite uncomfortable. Moving on to the third point on Daf Lamed Bet is anaf itzavot refers to hadas, beautiful. We learn that out from the pasuk. It refers to hadas, no other thing. We're on topic of hadasim, which brings us to Daf Lamed Gimel. Lamed Gimel discusses what happens if there is dichri it's the mitzvah or not. If you have a mitzvah and it becomes invalid, meaning that you can no longer fulfill it, can you now, if it, let's say, regenerates, or if it, something that, let's say you had a berry that grew on top of a hadas or whatever it was, or on top of a lulav, and it became invalid, and then the berry fell off, or whatever it was, or rovo, it still was kosher, it became invalid, then became kosher again. Can you still use it? Is it doche? Meaning that once we push it aside, it can't be pushed back in. A lot of interesting discussions there, and we apply to different cases, and then we move on to the second point of Daf, which discusses if you have a hadas that is rov berries, which make it invalid, so seemingly it's doche, it's pushed aside, could you take off the berries to make it kosher again? And because you want to take off some berries on Yontif, which might be a problem, but if you did it, then it would become kosher because it has less berries than hadas. Now it's not a rov berry hadas, it's a less berry hadas, and it works. Okay, then we move on to the third point Daf, which we're going to be discussing Arve Nachal, right? The Gemara discusses this willow branch that's, what goes on over there. That's the end of Daf Lamed Gimel. Moving on to Daf Lamed Daled. Daf Lamed Daled is the ladder. So the first point to discuss is going to be Tzavtzafa. We discussed within the Arava. Now we move on to from Lulav to Hadas to Arava. So Arve Nachal is the end of Lamed Gimel into Lamed Daled. The Mishnah discusses Arava, and we said that Lamed Daled Tzavtzafa is a type of plant with a thin white stem, and that is not considered to be what we're looking for the arava, I think. And the second point is going to be discussing that when you have how much of each of the arba you have to take. Could you take 3 hadasim to arava, some lulav, and different discussions going on there. 3 hadasim, yeah, I think I got that right. Okay, moving on to The next point of daf is going to be discussing, I'm not sure by 3, 2, 1, I'll look it up again, and the middle, but that was the discussion, the second point of daf lamadad, how many of each are minim, and then we discussed what happens to take the etrog all alone as a kosher, you have to have it all together. Okay, that's the end of daf lamadad. Daf lamad is going to be interesting. Siman, it's la, 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 the children's choir is singing la, 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 which reminds you of 3 points. The first point is going to be what happens when you have or what's the discussion that Gemara has when you discuss pre-its hadar. Is it etrog hadar beilano? Is it something that's constantly there? The different interpretations of what it means pre-its hadar, or however you want to pronounce it. And based off that discussion, the Gemara discusses 2 different things about the etrog session. Now we moved on from not only lulav to arava to hadas, lulav to hadas to arava. Now we move on from arava to the next part of the arba minim of the etrog. What happens now? The Gemara discusses if you have an etrog that's orla, is the puzzle, and the Gemara discusses as well. Third part on daf is an etrog that the nitla pitzimato, when the pitam is removed, is it still kosher? Okay, I'm gonna pause for 1 second. I'm gonna pick it right up.